Hi, my name is Pat Salmon. I am a retired curator of history and a Staten Island historian, and I'm thrilled to be at the Noble Maritime Collection today to talk about murders that occurred on the high seas of Staten Island. Most of these murders occurred in and around the waters of the island or involved water in some way, shape, or form. Now, it was back in 1889 when they found a very unusual prayer book, 2 black bracelets, a pin, and an unusual gold ring on a body that washed up by the Clifton Boat Club. It was a good thing it washed up, so to speak, because very often when bodies are in the water off Staten Island, they sometimes go way out and get swept into the Atlantic Ocean and they're never seen again. So this particular person came up right where the boat club was, not far from the Alice Austin house on the east shore of Staten Island. This awful discovery was made on May 12th, 1889. They called in a local doctor to look at the body, and she was identified by Dr. Samuel A. Robinson of West New Brighton. Her name was Mary Tobin. Only a month before, she had actually left the employ of Dr. Robinson. And then she said she was going off to visit her family who lived in Franklin, Pennsylvania. She was thrilled to tell everybody that when she returned, she was to be married. It was odd, though, because most people had no idea who she was marrying. Some thought he was a well-off New York City stockbroker. Others believed he was a gentleman who lived on Staten Island. In any event, before her trip to Pennsylvania, she told Dr. Robinson that she would be sending a trunk to her friend, Mrs. Frank McKinney of Long Island City. She'd be shipping a trunk to Mrs. McKinney, and she'd also be shipping a trunk to her brothers in Pennsylvania. This turned out to be an assumption on everyone's part, because a few days later, Mrs. McKinney came to Dr. Robinson's office and said, whatever happened to Mary? Mary never showed up at my place in Long Island City. And not too long after that, it turns out that her brothers came to town asking the same question. Now, with this body being retrieved, it was now in the morgue in the Clifton area of Staten Island. And by order of the coroner, Martin Hughes, yes, the same Martin Hughes whose name is on the funeral home today, it was ordered that Dr. John Feeney, the health officer of Middleton, because Staten Island was divided into different townships at this time, it was decided that an autopsy would be performed on the deceased. Dr. Feeney refused to share any of the results of the autopsy until the official inquest was held. It was just a terrible mystery, and there was vast speculation. How did Mary end up dead? When people asked if her fiancé knew of her demise, most people just vaguely shook their head, and since they didn't really know his identity. In fact, no one recalled seeing her with any other man other than Dr. Samuel Robinson or his son. One clue did surface, though. It turned out that Mary was last seen at the home of Dr. William J. Bryan, who had an office on Bard Avenue in West Brighton. It seems that Dr. Bryan walked her to the Livingston train station, which was at the end of Bard Avenue, after they had chatted for about 20 minutes or so. This turned out to be the last time anybody saw Mary Tobin alive. When interviewed, Dr. Bryan refused to discuss whether he was the elusive fiancé. But one thing was certain: Mary and Dr. Bryan had become very, very close after he had departed as a junior physician in Dr. Robinson's office. So for this reason, there was not good feeling between Dr. Bryan and Dr. Robinson. Dr. Robinson felt that Dr. Bryan opened his practice too close to Dr. Robinson's, and it affected the number of patients that were making, scheduled visits to Dr. Robinson's office. There were all kinds of reports about Mary's, what happened to her, where did she disappear, was she missing for a few days before she washed up on the shoreline? Well, one report came in from a man who was known as Harry the Trapeze Artist. He claimed to have seen Mary on the bow of the Staten Island ferry. This was the 3 p.m. boat on May 3rd. And he was smoking a cigar, and he went to throw the cigar overboard, and he turned to the side, and when he looked back, he said Mary was missing. And it was his opinion that Mary had jumped overboard. There was another feeling that Mary was walking along the trestle work of the railroad that ran in front of Sailor Snug Harbor along Richmond Terrace, and that she perhaps lost her footing, fell into the water, and drowned. There was all kinds of crazy stories like this going on. Some things, though, were known for certain. Mary had started her employment with Dr. Robinson in 1887. She was his office assistant, and she became very attached to Dr. Robinson's father, who wasn't very well. He was an ill man, and he lived in the home of Dr. Robinson, where Mary also lived, too. Robinson described her as calm and stoical, and he said she would never do anything against her own inclinations. When asked to identify the fiancé, Robinson refused to divulge that information, only that Mary often spoke of his fine beard and mustache. Robinson bluntly added that he never really liked the woman. Owing to Mary's strong personality, no, he did not believe she committed suicide. Most thought she had come to her sad end through foul play. The authorities really had nothing to say on the subject because they weren't able to find any clues, so the suspense mounted. The identity of the mysterious fiancé, though, was finally divulged by Mrs. Frank McKinney, who we already mentioned, and it was Dr. William J. Bryan. He was described as a fine-looking, athletic man with pleasant manners. He was about 30 years old. He was interviewed by a newspaper reporter from The World on May 15th, and the reporter stated that the doctor did not have the appearance of a lover mourning the untimely fate of his sweetheart. In fact, the reporter thought Bryan was almost jovial, a report which Dr. Bryan flatly denied. When asked if he was Mary's fiancé, Bryan became grave and evasive and replied, "I don't care to say anything in answer to that." He did admit, though, being the last person to see Mary Tobin alive. The inquest finally took place on May 16th, 1889, at the Rosebank Funeral Home of Coroner Martin Hughes. Wearing French-trimmed spectacles and perfect attire, Dr. Bryan stated that he had last seen Mary at his office on April 15th between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. They chatted for 20 minutes. During that time, Dr. Bryan got an urgent call that he had to go out to Willowbrook section of Staten Island because somebody was very sick, somebody being one of his patients. He didn't get back to his office till midnight, and before he left, again, he walked Mary to the train station. Dr. Feeney was then called to the stand, and he revealed that the young woman was not poisoned. She had died from asphyxia. They had a pathologist on the stand who reported that Miss Tobin was not pregnant, which was very good for Dr. Bryan. The second night of the inquest, Dr. Samuel Robinson took the stand. He stated he had not seen Mary since April 15th. At that time, she was cheerful, and he did not believe for 1 second that she had taken her own life. Again, on May 20th, Dr. Bryan was questioned about the call he made to Willowbrook on the night that Mary disappeared. And it goes on and on. The railroad ticket lady who sold the tickets at the station reported she never saw Mary that night. The inquest did nothing but bring out more questions. And owing to the numerous questions that were asked, another inquest was held, this one on May 27th, 1889. Robinson stating Mary Tobin did not drown, Dr. Loomis, the pathologist, stating that he couldn't specify any single cause of death. A number of other witnesses took the stand, but little was added to their testimony. At 11 p.m., Coroner Hughes called an adjournment. Still, they had another hearing and an inquest. This one was on June 4th. And nothing really came of that. And still another hearing took place on July 3rd, 1889. And quite honestly, nothing was divulged at any of the 4 hearings or the inquests. The World newspaper even stated that it was a stupid investigation, and they declared that the newspapers had discovered more facts than had the coroner. The publication further wrote, quote, "Evidence steadily points to the conclusion that Mary Tobin was murdered and her lifeless body cast into the silent waters of the harbor to be mangled into an unrecognizable mass by the paddle wheels of the ferry boats." Yellow journalism at its best. Others called Coroner Hughes testy, and they noted that he even neglected to bring a stenographer to document the testimony. Instead, he took notes by himself. Everybody was talking. Still, the upper echelon of Staten Island was saying, as a rising young physician, why did Dr. Bryan connect to Mary Tobin? It made no sense. She did not complement his rising career. Many were surprised when he announced their engagements, since it was believed that he, quote, would have looked higher for an alliance. Further damage was done in the summer of 1889 when a woman from Watertown, New York, charged that Dr. Bryan and a woman known only as the Lady in Black were having improper relations at her home in West New Brighton. The article in an upstate New York newspaper intimated that Dr. Bryan and she were in a conspiracy to kill her husband in order that they could be married. The gossip continued, and it was said that the woman in black had caused all kinds of problems between Mary and Dr. Bryan. Dr. Bryan firmly reiterated that he lacked any knowledge whatsoever on Mary Tobin's death. Oh my goodness. And it just went on and on and on and on. And it seems that Mary sometimes spent late evenings at Dr. Bryan's home, so that really gave people further cause to talk nastily about her. No one ever solved the mysterious death of Mary Tobin. In fact, Dr. William Bryan would go on to have a stellar career as a physician on Staten Island. Not to mention, he was active with the Staten Island Cricket and Baseball Club, the Staten Island Whist Club, the Masons, the Richmond County Country Club, and the Richmond County Automobile Club. On April 18th, 1900, he married Mary Rawson, the daughter of the DA, Sidney Rawson. He even became chief of staff at S.R. Smith Infirmary, which we know recently as the Staten Island Hospital. Well, to me recently, but really for the last 90 years. Dr. Bryan died at the age of 72 on February 25th, 1932. Dr. Robinson's career was marked by several very strange events. It seems he was treating a woman by the name of Lavinia Van Emberg around 1892, and she put him in charge of her finances, which were quite considerable. But then she seemed to have lost trust in him, and she wanted an accounting of her finances, which he never gave to her. Witnesses came forward to say that Mrs. Van Emberg had complained that Robinson had changed her will, and that she had requested an accounting, which she never got from her. The story went on, but there was never a successful conclusion. The Great Tottenville Mystery. It was a terrible discovery. A man had had his throat sliced with a shaving razor, and he lay dead on the Astor House hotel floor in Manhattan. This took place on February 3rd, 1891, and there was nothing on the body to indicate who this man was. He had cut all the labels out of his clothing. There were no letters, no passport, no anything to provide his identification. He signed into the hotel as Fred Evans of England, but nobody believed that was his real identity. The dead man was said to be delicate, small framed, with the tiny hands of a gentleman. He had a limp mustache, curly brown hair. When they found him, he only had brown woolen underclothing on. All manner of individuals came forward to say they knew who the deceased was. A woman from Boston ventured in to see if he was a portrait painter she knew. She agreed to return with a friend who also knew the artist. No one ever requested the body of this Fred Evans, so he was buried at the Potter's Field on Hart Island on March 3rd, 1891. Meanwhile, a seemingly unrelated event occurred at the isolated village of Tottenville on the evening of March 11th, 1891. The body of a brawny man was found floating in the water off of Tottenville. He was covered with a sheet. They put him on ice in the home of undertaker Isaac P. Bedell. Yes, the same Bedell Pizzo funeral home that you know today. The remains were actually identified by a man by the name of Gustav New, who lived at 127 East 58th Street in Manhattan. He identified the man as Carl Ruttinger, who had disappeared on February 2nd. And this was verified who Ruttinger was because actually on Ruttinger's body, they had found a passport to identify it, so they had corroboration. It seems that back on January 9th or 10th, Carl Ruttinger and another man had rented a room from Mr. No. According to No, the partner was an Englishman with small hands who was delicate. His manner was also effeminate. It was a contrast to Ruttinger, the big brawny guy. William Wright was his name. He was said to be quick and nervous. One acquaintance said of Wright, if you ever met him, you never forgot him because he always wore a pained expression. Wright seemed to regard Ruttinger as the head of their partnership. Apparently, Wright would do nothing without consulting Mr. Ruttinger, and they had recently arrived from Europe, where Ruttinger worked in the lace-making business. Wright was said to have been a diamond cutter. They were related by marriage. New said the two were like brothers, and they thought a great deal of each other. After they took their dinner every night, they never went out. They instead spent the rest of the evening in the room that they rented from him. New believed they were discouraged by the poor results in finding employment. And then, on February 1st, Wright took off for Boston, and he said he had a diamond setting position available at that location. Ruttinger, though, had applied for several jobs in lace houses in Manhattan, but nothing had come of it. When Ruttinger's body was discovered, they found 2 Staten Island Rapid Transit Railroad tickets in his pocket that were dated for February 2nd. 2 tickets. With Ruttinger dead on the gurneys, authorities were saying, where is this guy Wright? Why hasn't he showed up to claim the body or asked about the whereabouts of Ruttinger? It seems that Ruttinger was married to Wright's sister, and Wright's sister lived in London with another brother. Ruttinger and his wife originally lived in Italy, but had moved to Germany, then to London, and it was there that Wright joined them the whole time as Ruttinger's companion. Wright really had no business. He was more of a gentleman during the time they lived in London. One man who knew him said his business was rolling cigarettes and riding his bicycle. All of the Wright offspring, it seems, had inherited a large amount of money from their father. Also, it seems that in the summer of 1890, the marriage of Carl and Madge Rudinger was falling apart. So Wright and Rudinger boarded a boat and shipped for the United States. They arrived in America on December 31st, 1890. They were looking forward to a new year. On January 22nd, Wright wrote home that he and Rudinger were actually going to move to the Midwest and maybe start a new life out there. If anything happened to him, Carl wrote home that he wanted his property to go to his wife and his 2 children. It was discovered that Rudinger actually had life insurance worth $21,000, leading some to believe it was a graveyard insurance plot. What is that? It's a plot geared to cash in on the insurance money while you're still alive. In other words, the body found off Tottenville was somebody else, but Rudinger could apply for the insurance while people thought he was dead. Pretty strange plot, I know. Police also noticed that when he was alive, Rudinger must have been a real Hercules of a guy. He was so big. And they couldn't understand when the body was found why his hands were tied together. And they couldn't figure out that a guy this big couldn't just bust these ties because they were very loose and very weak. Why didn't he just bust the ties if he was murdered by somebody? So they began to question whether he was alive when the cords were tied. You know, it was just, the whole thing was very, very strange. His suit was very orderly. His tie was in place. They did find a handkerchief stuffed in his mouth with the initials WW. Police could not simply understand why he did not bite the fingers that put the handkerchief in his mouth. These 2 points left the police thinking that the binding and the handkerchief were used to throw them off. No one could even determine what brought Rudinger to Staten Island. He was from Europe, he went to Manhattan, okay, but why Staten Island? None of it made any sense. They looked at these train tickets in Rudinger's pocket, and they started saying, where is Wright? Where is Wright? We don't understand it. None of this was making any sense whatsoever. Nobody could understand why Wright was so silent when his best friend was dead. If he had not read about Rudinger's death in the newspaper, why hadn't he at least written to Rudinger at the Manhattan address at News House? But eventually a break came. It seems that Rudinger had left a valise somewhere, and in it was a negative of 2 men. When he compared the images with the dead man, the district attorney on Staten Island, Fitzgerald, noted that one of the men was Rudinger. Most importantly, though, was the similarity between the other man in the negative, and the man who was found dead at the Astor House, the man who I signed in as Fred Evans. In the long run, everyone realized that Fred Evans was actually William Wright, especially after they found a brand new nickel in Wright's belongings at the Astor House. The Staten Island Rapid Transit had always bought many shiny, bright nickels to give out as change when Staten Island Rapid Transit tickets were bought. Remember, Rudinger had 2 tickets in his pocket, so now Wright had the change for the tickets in his pocket. It seems that sometime during the night after Wright had helped Rudinger to commit suicide off the water of Staten Island, Wright had gone back to the Astor House and killed himself. And nobody, unfortunately, came to collect Carl Rudinger's body. Instead, he was put into coffin number 85 at plot 169 at the Bethel Methodist Episcopal Church in Tottenville. For his part, Wright was actually buried in Greenwood Cemetery. The whole thing was very, very peculiar. And as I said, the mystery was never really solved, although people speculated, as I said, that Ruttinger had committed suicide while Wright had also committed suicide back at the hotel. Oh, and by the way, the insurance money, the $21,000, actually went to Carl Ruttinger's mother, and everything was paid up in full by the insurance company because they felt that it could never be proven that it was a suicide. Because back in the old days, and perhaps even now, I'm not sure because my head lives in the past, they didn't pay on suicides back in the old days, the insurance companies. All right, a rum raid gone awry. There was a steam lighter pulled up to the New Brighton dock of the Tanner Milling Company. 4 men readied themselves to jump on the dock. It was March 2nd, 1922. The crooks, because they were crooks, were hoping for a profitable evening. The plan was to steal $35,000 worth of stored, legal, government-bonded liquor. It was prohibition. Liquor, government-approved or not, was difficult to come by. As they rapped on the warehouse entrance, one of the thugs had a blackjack. When night watchman Michael Connor answered the door, he was clubbed into insensibility. After lingering for 7 arduous days, Connor succumbed to the splintering of his skull on March 9th, 1922. Michael Connor was slain for attempting to protect 30 barrels of whiskey. The bonded booze was stored not far from here. It was stored at the corner of Jersey Street and Richmond Terrace. 9 men would be arrested for the murder of Michael Connor. The scoundrels were said to be members of a bootleg ring that regularly dealt in illicit swindles, some netting millions of dollars. 5 of the men were held on conspiracy charges. 4 of the men, including Raymond Collins, James Pym, Frank Brown, and Joseph Gonigal, were charged with conspiracy and murder. Raymond Collins was the first one to be brought to trial for slaughtering Michael Connor. Former Richmond County District Attorney Frank Innes defended Collins, while Judge J. Harry Tiernan presided over the court proceedings. The trial began April 17, 1922. Rensselaer Carney, certainly a memorable name for a mobster, I think you'll agree, took the stand as a witness for the state. He was supplying testimony against the guys that he was with the night of Michael Connor's murder. It only took 4 days. Trials were quick back then. Raymond Collins was convicted of killing Michael Connor. Defying his lawyer's advice, Collins took the stand in his own defense. Under cross-examination, he was forced to admit that yes, he was an ex-convict, and that yes, he was currently out of prison on a suspended conviction for passing a worthless check in the amount of $11,000. And yes, not only was it a bad check, it was a bounced payment for a bootleg deal. Collins was a fascinating criminal, and he informed his captive courthouse audience that he was once a steward at the St. Regis Hotel. He also sang and illustrated songs in movie theaters. Quite a colorful life for this character, but there was more. He was a graduate of Dartmouth University. But none of this trivia mattered, as the case fell apart for Collins when he admitted that he was the first individual at the door when Michael Connor opened it. It was an efficient jury. They countered with a conviction of first-degree murder for college grad Raymond Collins. It only took them 1 hour and 15 minutes. Collins was sentenced to death by electrocution at Sing Sing prison. He declared his innocence. When asked why he did not plead guilty to murder in the 2nd degree, like his co-defendants, Collins responded that he was not guilty of murder in any degree. Said to be the most learned inmate at the Sing Sing death house, Raymond Collins added luster to his name when he won the condemned man's checkers champion in November 1922. At Sing Sing prison, they were housed in a circle of cells, and the inmates were not allowed visual contact with each other. But they did manage to play checkers with numbered board squares in their cells. All the inmates would be silent except the two contenders, who called their moves aloud. Referred to as, quote, the least coveted title in the world, no one thought for even 1 second that Death House checkers would gain in popularity. Sing Sing checkers champion Collins received very good news the following month when the Court of Appeals overturned his conviction and granted him a new trial in the murder of Michael Collins. The trial was granted on the grounds that Judge Tiernan had erred when charging the jury. On June 14, 1923, Raymond C. Collins was acquitted of murdering Michael Connor. When the jury's verdict was read, Collins supposedly grabbed District Attorney Joseph Malloy's hand and exclaimed, 12 honest men have declared that I did not murder the watchman. D.A. Malloy was not done with Collins, though. As he gritted his teeth, he said he would have Collins remanded to jail for 10 days while he, the DA, went before a grand jury for an indictment against Collins on a charge of conspiring to steal liquor. Meanwhile, the killer of Michael Connor was never brought to trial. A former cabaret beauty and her dashing young sergeant. The butt end of a .45 caliber Smith & Wesson regulation army pistol provided the black eye and bruises on Elsie Smith. It also provided the bullet that was in her brain. The mystery of who inflicted the bullet and the bruises was on everybody's mind. Elsie Smith had been found dead on her bed by 3 men attached to the 1st Tank Corps at Miller Field in New Dorp, Staten Island, a small military base at New Dorp Beach on January 3rd, 1932. They were dispatched when a neighbor, Agnes Ryan, reported that she hadn't seen Mrs. Smith since January 1st when she, Mrs. Ryan, Mrs. Smith, and Mrs. Smith's husband had been playing cards on New Year's Eve. Her husband that she met, the husband of Elsie Smith, was Sergeant Albert L. Smith. Mrs. Ryan said she left the couple about 1 p.m. Everybody was in fine spirits. When the police inspector arrived, Ernest von Wegner, he found that a fierce struggle had taken place in the Smith apartment. Chairs were strewn about, tables were broken. Somebody had even made an unsuccessful attempt at cleaning up blood from the floor of the apartment. Sergeant Albert Smith was actually stationed at Camp Dix in Wrightstown, New Jersey, when he was attached to the Ordnance Department. He was in charge of all the rifles and pistols at Camp Dix. He was on a 4-day leave when his wife was found battered and lifeless at New Dorp Beach on Staten Island. Mrs. Ryan thought she heard gunfire around 5 a.m., but then she thought maybe it was just a garbage can falling over. But the tenant above Ryan also reported hearing gunshots. A military base murder is usually handled by the officials on the military base, but for some reason this case was handed over to the New York City Police Department. And the people at Miller Field actually called for a widespread manhunt, as did, of course, the New York City Police Department, to find Sergeant Smith. After an inspection of his apartment, it was revealed that civilian clothes were missing, but his uniform was hung very nicely in the couple's closet. They even dragged the ocean off of Miller Field in the hope that they would find a murder weapon or maybe the sergeant's body. Several soldiers reported seeing Smith at the shoreline on the morning of January 2nd. Originally from Russia, Elsie Smith had been married before she met Sergeant Smith. She had been married to a man named Ivan Holzov in Siberia in 1914. There were conflicting reports how Mrs. Smith met Mr. Smith, but it seems that she was very concerned about the fact that she had been married before. And she went to talk to an elder in the Russian Orthodox Church that she attended out in Ozone Park. There was no Russian Orthodox Church on Staten Island. She told the elder she really wanted to tell her husband about this first marriage. And she really wanted to tell him that back in Russia, she had been a cabaret dancer. And the elders had advised her, don't say anything. You don't want to upset your husband. Don't say anything. But some believe that she probably did tell her husband, and he didn't take the information very well. It was quickly assumed that Smith became so enraged that he beat Elsie and then shot and killed her. Others considered that Smith might have angered some people when he was stationed in the Far East, and perhaps that person had come to the U.S. and killed his wife. Still another theory was heralded that Albert was livid because his wife would not give him money from their savings account so that he could purchase his military discharge. Police received a surprising report on January 3rd from a witness who saw Albert Smith leaving Staten Island. But it was not a reliable report. In any event, that in addition to his problems of being sought by the police for murdering his wife, by January 7th, Smith is listed as AWOL from the United States Army. So now he's got Uncle Sam looking after him too. So he's got lots of problems going on. Smith, though, was actually found, and he was found walking around Newdorp. And when they arrested him, he said he really didn't, none of those things happened. None of those things that, he wanted his wife to give him money, he was mad about her first marriage. That was all not true. He said he didn't want his wife living at Camp Dix in New Jersey. He said it was a terrible place that was unfit for a woman. And since he was now stationed at Camp Dix, he assumed that they were both going to have to move there. And instead of his wife moving to Camp Dix, he killed her. Anyway, Smith, it really became apparent that he had some kind of mental disturbances. And even though it was proven that he did, he was still charged with murder in the first degree. Before the trial, though, Smith had a lunacy test in which psychiatrists from both the defense and the prosecution agreed that Smith was insane. But this was not the end of the matter. He had to be declared insane by a jury of 12 individuals. In the courtroom, Smith was described as being continuously distracted, looking here, looking there. When he was asked questions, he either refused to answer or he would just move his lips and not say anything. This went on for a while. It also came out at the trial that Smith's real last name was Zorhyde, Zorhyde, and he changed it to Smith after he had been bullied for his whole life. People used to call him Sorehide. It seems that one of the psychiatrists in attendance said that this was the foundation upon which rests his present mental unbalance. The jury ruled Mr. Smith was insane and that he should be committed to an institution. Judge Moskowitz, who presided over the case, declared the verdict was the only one possible. Elsie Smith was waked at the W.C. McCallum's funeral home in Great Kills, and she was buried at Cypress Hills National Cemetery in Brooklyn. Aside from Mrs. Smith's brutal death, one important question does linger. Why would Sergeant Albert Smith be put in charge of an ordnance department? The Frederick Bergman murder. Frederick Bergman's daughter was dead. As his wife placed daisies around the deceased at their home, they heard the intrusive noise of hammering from another part of the house. The grieving father, Frederick Bergman, went directly to his father-in-law's quarters, knowing that only Thomas Burke would create such a racket at a time like this. When challenged, Burke blurted out an array of angry, colorful remarks, and he continued to pound. Bergman departed, but returned to confront Burke a second time. When Bergman reopened the door, he was hit by gunshot. He exited the building, collapsed dead to the ground. According to Thomas Burke, his father-in-law, it was not murder. He claimed that Bergman knew the door was booby-trapped and had knowingly opened the door to release the trigger and receive the death blast. Burke insisted it was suicide. The first policeman to arrive at the scene reported that he found, quote, an old single-barreled shotgun partly suspended by ropes from freshly driven staples in the ceiling. A cord and wire were connected to the door with the trigger of the gun, but the muzzle pointed toward the ground. Ever so faintly was written on the door, gun set. Burke insisted that Bergman knew the gun was set to shoot anyone who opened the door. In addition, Burke contended that he was not in the room when the gun was discharged. But the police investigation revealed a number of things, including that the shot that entered Bergman's body should have also gone into the door, as it was not a bullet. It was duck shot that actually sprayed outward when it was released from the gun. Hence, the investigators believed that it was not a booby trap that killed Bergman, it was Burke, boldly holding the gun and firing at him. Burke was arrested and transported to the Stapleton lockup on August 17, 1894. Burke was a known eccentric. He, along with his son-in-law Bergman, led very checkered lives. On March 22, 1890, Bergman was convicted of larceny after he was found rifling through the trunk of a guest staying at a South Beach hotel that he managed. He was remanded to the Kings County Penitentiary for 6 months for this offense. Burke, for his part, he used to sell sand from South Beach. Must have been a lot of money in sand. Apparently, he was not financially successful at that endeavor, so he entered another enterprise, distillation, illegal distillation. Government officers arrested him circa 1892 for operating an illegal still. The unlawful whiskey and rum he cooked up was spirited away in the loads of stand that were buried in the hold of his schooner. When the schooner returned, it came with molasses, which Burke used to make his illegal hooch. Burke's abode was another interesting spot, very unique. It stood along the shoreline landscape of South Beach. It was once a houseboat, but it had become so derelict that Burke had it placed on the shoreline of South Beach, and he patched it up with all manner of flotsam and jetsam that washed up on the shorelines. He was believed to also be a squatter, and he had been living on South Beach for almost 33 years. Bergman married Burke's only daughter in 1889. The father, Thomas Burke, was bitterly opposed to the union. Even so, they both lived in Burke's residence on the shoreline of South Beach, with the result that the two men constantly fought. In one episode, Burke even attempted to shoot Bergman. In front of the judge, the elderly man asserted that the gun was not set as he was working on the hinges of the door when Bergman arrived. Now Burke changed the story. He argued that it was an accident, not a suicide. Quote, There was a wire running from the door to the string which was fastened to the trigger, but the gun was not set to kill anybody. I only set the gun at night to catch people who tried to steal from my house. Now, while I was working away at the hinges, my son-in-law came in and opened the door. A piece of wood fell on the gun and it went off and killed my son-in-law. That is all there is to it, according to Burke. Police also located a witness who was standing nearby when he saw Bergman leaving Burke's room exclaiming, "I'm murdered, I'm murdered." Just a few minutes later, the witness said Burke exited the room very calmly. On September 7th, after 2 hours of deliberation, the jury could not come to a unanimous decision. So Burke was sent back to jail, and on September 28th, the Richmond County Grand Jury again indicted him for murdering Bergman. Burke went before Judge Edgar Cullen on October 28th and decided to plead guilty to second-degree manslaughter. Burke's lawyer asked for leniency since Burke was a wounded veteran of the Civil War and because he was elderly. He was sentenced to 10 years at Sing Sing prison. Burke would be released after 6 years of good behavior, but no one believed that even for 1 minute that Burke would be released early because it was impossible for Burke to actually behave. All right. Thanks so very much. I just want to mention that 3 of these stories can be found in 2 of my books, Murder and Mayhem on Staten Island, and Staten Island, The Forgotten Borough, Murderers and Mysteries from Staten Island, both published by the History Press. Both available at my website, patsalmonhistory.com. Thanks so much. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye. I invite you all to go to noblemaritime.org/now, capital N-O-W, where you will find a number of wonderful videos about Staten Island history and other maritime subjects. Check it out. You won't be disappointed.